Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
What's a college athlete supposed to do? Is it his job to get an education or her job to play ball? They're required to be a full-time student, to go to class, to hold down a full-time job, essentially, of play and practice in athletics. They're amateur athletes, certainly, but professional athletes playing under professional-type pressures from the alumni, the fans, and what must be a money-conscious athletic department. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we'll talk about the student-athlete, what the definition is, perhaps what it ought to be. Our panelists today are John Rouse, our executive producer, and a member of the political science faculty at Ball State University. Dick Hunsaker, who is associate head basketball coach at Ball State. John Reno, who is Ball State's representative to the Mid-American Conference and the NCAA. And Warren Vanderhill, the provost at Ball State. Warren, let's start it with you. Since you're a former NCAA rep for Ball State, and since you're a chief academic officer now here at Ball State, the mixing of the athlete and the student, what is that individual? Is he primarily or she primarily a student or an athlete?
Well, in my view, I think they're primarily students. This is a university, and I think that the reason that coaches such as Coach Hunsaker and all of our coaches, indeed coaches everywhere, recruit young people to come here is that they want them to get an outstanding education. The difficulty I think that athletes have is then trying to fit in to the educational process, as you've indicated in your opening remarks, the time demands that are placed on them as far as what they have to do to practice and play. And during the season, it becomes even more difficult because, of course, they're playing a lot of games away from home, as well as the home schedule. But I cannot tell you emphatically, I would state, that this is a university, and universities are here to educate young people.
Dick, you see this from the coaching standpoint. You know what the time demands are on a student in terms of athletics, in terms of practice, in terms of game time, in terms of travel. Do they have the time, and do they have the time to concentrate on academics?
Well, you know, they've done studies in the past, and I can't really cite you the statistical or the grade point that they've analyzed, but they've found that the student athlete will do better in season academically than they will out of season. And that is because of the time structure that they have. When they get out of season, particularly in basketball, you'll find this in the springtime when the flowers start blooming and the girls are out there by the duck pond here at Ball State, that their academics waver a little bit and they get caught up in just being a so-called college student, and they lose a little bit of that discipline and structure that they have during the season. So the time demands that an athlete has are excessive, but I really don't believe that it affects their academic success or their academic progress because of the discipline and the structure of their time.
John, we look across the board at all conference schools or all schools in the NCAA, and what is the position of the conference, of the NCAA, in terms of what these people are supposed to be doing, what these students are doing? They're put in a very competitive nature in terms of athletics, but they're also expected to perform as students.
Well, the NCAA is very emphatic that we have student athletes. It's a part of the Constitution, and they indicate that athletics is an integral part of education, and they stress that. And the message from the NCAA and the message from the conferences is that academics, that's the reason that we have the students here, and that athletics is an extracurricular activity that students should have an opportunity to experience.
John, you're a teacher, you're not a coach. You have athletes in the classroom. What are these people? What are they?
Well, they're students, first of all. And I've found that for the most part, the athletes are as attentive to come into class as any person is. So I have never had any kind of difficulty in terms of the student part of the athlete. But I think what we have here, of course, is an issue of politics and economics. This is a program of economics and politics. As I've said before, we live in what I call the CNN society. In other words, the television society, which there is a big focus upon big business. The NCAA is, of course, politics. In a sense, you have the politics of the big schools versus the small schools. You also could say, perhaps, that the NCAA is an economic cartel. I'm often to quote sometimes Karl Marx, for example. This being the Christmas season, Karl Marx's focus was that religion was the opium of the people. I say that sports are the opium of the people. So sports, big business, even though we have a focus upon academics, as far as this is concerned, there's also the focus upon business and athletics, and sometimes it becomes abusive. Perhaps abusive not only of the athletics, but also of the person and the student. So it gets back to your original question: what is the relationship? The relationship is the same that you would expect of any student who is working, for example, for a living, has a part-time job. In a sense, the athlete has a part-time job.
It is a big business. Athletic departments have big budgets, and those 18, 19, 20-year-old kids have to perform, particularly in basketball, particularly in football, if this big business is to run. That seems like a lot of pressure.
Well, there's no question about that. I think that what has changed in the last couple of decades is the amount of money that's involved, especially in basketball and football at the Division I level. I think now you're dealing not just with the amount of money that can be generated in gate receipts, but you're dealing with an absolutely incredible amount of money that's derived from television revenue. I mean, when you think back as recently as 15 or 20 years ago, or as, the pre-ESPN, pre-CNN, as John points out, although that's not really much as far as television is concerned, but the pre-ESPN era, and you contrast that period with today and the number of basketball games and football games that you can see in a given week, and we're talking now about college athletics. I'm not talking about professional athletics. And it is a tremendous amount of revenue that's involved in the schools that can get on these evening prime time or Saturday afternoon or Sunday afternoon programs. A classic example I can give you is, think how recently it's been that you had prime time Sunday afternoon programming of featured basketball games, where you have a game between, let's get Georgetown together with North Carolina Chapel Hill, and we'll play at 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. Previously, that's really dead time as far as Sunday afternoon television time is concerned. Now you can sell a lot of sponsors on putting up the dollars to put Georgetown and North Carolina Chapel Hill on television.
And when you bring cable into it, and when you bring the television revenue into it, then television begins to dictate when the games are played. Maybe it's a Monday night game, as the Big Ten started doing a Monday night game because television said, we want a Monday night game.
Right.
Whether it's good or whether it fits into the student schedule, the school schedule, it fits into the television schedule. So who's running the show?
Well,
the consumer is.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Well,
the consumer is. Yeah. Because colleges, in a sense, are in the entertainment business. And as Warren says, Sunday afternoon, in fact, some households, I'm sure, have the television on, and the chatter is some basketball game in the background. Well, who's playing? Oh, I don't know who's playing. It doesn't matter. We want to see if the guard can shoot a three-point play.
Again, you're right. It's entertainment in that sense. Then the student athlete is an entertainer too. Is that my judgment?
I think there's another side to this too. We're talking about athletics being big business, and it certainly is big business. But let's look at the educational side of it in terms of finance. And I'd like to just point out the Mid-American Conference. The budgets in the Mid-American Conference are composed primarily of student service fees. The students help support athletics. These athletes are not in a position where they have to perform in much the same way as you would in the major institutions. I'll take the Big 8 Conference as an example. I mean, football is dominated by Oklahoma and Nebraska. They get people in those seats every week. At the bottom end of the Big 8 Conference, where they have to depend upon gate receipts, they don't have the gate receipts. It's just continually losing, where you have the Big 2 of Oklahoma and Nebraska. And look at the parity now in the Mid-American Conference, in football and in basketball and in many of the other sports. because their budgets are not, they don't have to rely strictly upon gate receipts. It's the educational approach to athletics, because the university is providing the funding, not the public nor the consumer, as John has said. You don't have to rely upon them.
But isn't it partly a problem where institutions, academic institutions, end up chasing the almighty dollar, and the values do get convoluted? Perhaps not in the Mid-American Conference, but as we've seen in certain large institutions, athletics is ahead of academics. It's always been the focus. I can think of schools. For example, I grew up very close to Clemson. Football was always king at Clemson. Now, incidentally, Clemson is also a very fine academic institution, but among the alumni at Clemson, football is the thing that brings them together.
You know, sports and athletics, as you alluded to earlier, is the opium of the society, or the focus of everything that we do now. The sports programs really provide the showcase for the institution. You talk of TV, the Ohio Valley Conference, which as far as notoriety as level of play is comparable to the Mid-American. I don't think it has the integrity and the credibility of the Mid-American Conference, but they're playing games at midnight on ESPN. They actually tip the game off at midnight, and there's zero revenue involved in those ball games. In fact, it almost ends up costing the institution money to have that game come on at that time, but just for that exposure, that television exposure on a national basis, they're willing to make that sacrifice.
Let's talk about the athlete for a minute himself. We talk about the kind of pressure that are involved there. You say they do better academically during the season when they have the demands of the practice schedule, and so they have to budget their time better. But there is a lot of pressure there. I mean, when you talk about the alumni, when you talk about the fans, the student body, that seems to be a lot of professional type pressure.
Yeah, the pressures, again, they do come predominantly from the outside. As far as I think the coaching staff, a basketball team at Ball State, a basketball team at say, Iowa, a basketball team out at UCLA, the team itself, is basically going to be the same, but the pressure, as you said, comes from the press. The media causes, is maybe why everything has changed in sports. The media focuses so much on negative. They want the spectacular, they want the sensational, and they sensationalize all stories. If they can get a reporter or somebody that can get some negative, or he can uncover something, the Lexington paper is, Herald Journal, is that what it's called down there, is winning prizes, Pulitzer prizes or whatever, for this uncovering of the Kentucky scandals. And so all those, the media has really played a big effect on the pressures, maybe more than any one single thing, and the demand for winning. Alumni want to win, but the alumni, Ball State alums, I'm not saying you don't understand what's going on, but what you read in the paper has a large influence about how you think the team should perform, and what's your expectations for the season.
Well, let's look at.
I thought you were going to respond from a media standpoint.
Well, in a way I am. But you look at what Ball State is going through now with its basketball program. That you have, as of this taping, I don't want to put a jinx on them, as of this taping, an undefeated season. Ball State's beginning to get national recognition, mentioned on the national sports programs on television, in the national print media, newspapers, magazines. The overall effect for that has to be good for the university, but it's coming not because of some academic excellence, though Ball State has a good academic record, but because of its sports program. But the university as a whole is going to benefit because of that.
Well, I'll tell you how much so. Some of you know that I'm from New York City. And in the week after we were first ranked in the CNN USA poll in the top 25, I had 5 or 6 phone calls from friends of mine that I have not heard from in 10 or 12 years, but people I either played against or played with in New York City when I was playing in high school, and then went on to play in college, and then would go back and play in summer leagues. And this is what the focal point was. I mean, I'd like to think that if we had a successful Rhodes Scholar candidate or a Marshall Scholarship candidate, and that appeared in the New York Times, that the same people would have called me up. I think a couple of them may well have called me up about that to congratulate me. But I can guarantee you that as long as you're in the top 25, you're going to get a lot of attention, particularly in media centers. And since New York City happens to be one of those, this is the kind of thing that these friends of mine look at, and this is what gets them to start playing with a touch-tone phone to call and say, hey, what's going on there in the heart of the country? You've got a basketball team that for the first time is ranked in the top 25. So that's something that really impresses them.
Sure.
Larry, I think one interesting point is that if I can go back to my quote on Clemson, a former Clemson president made the outstanding comment that there was a sports page but no academics page. And so I think that's part of our society, that there is a big focus in the newspapers upon sports, but there is no academic page. So a second thing I think we could say, if you look at a place as diverse as Ball State is, diversity in terms of professions, in terms of academic disciplines, political science, chemistry, history, just a whole host of diversity. A winning basketball team is a thing that could bring us together. We can all identify with a clean run meaning honest, athletic program in the sense we can identify. So from that point of view, I think the athletics can bring us all together from a very diversity of academic professions.
Okay. John, you want to say something?
I think not only can it bring us together, unify all of us, John, but I think there's another thing to look at also. Anytime that an institution has a winning and successful program, if you look at admission applications, those admission applications will increase. They'll go up because the students are interested. They want to identify with a successful program. And I can go back to one of the schools in the Mid-American Conference. Prior to their coming into the conference, they won the national championship, the NC2A. It was Division II at that time, football championship. It was a time when admissions and enrollment was dropping. Their admission applications went up 21% in January of the year following their national championship.
You talk about the Subway alumni. I think they talk about it at Notre Dame or any of these schools, that all of a sudden people begin to identify with the institution because of that winning record.
Right.
Well, that goes back to the point I think you mentioned about entertainment. I mean, I agree with John wholeheartedly. I think that the Mid-American Conference is one of the best examples I have ever found of balance between academics and athletics. And I'm very proud of that fact and proud that we're a member of that conference. But I recently had the opportunity to spend some time in Las Vegas and talk to some of the people on the coaching staff at UNLV, where you're staying in a hotel down on the Strip that we're all familiar with in that rather interesting and I think quite atypical American community. And here are members of the coaching staff who say to me, we're competing with that. Here we are in this wonderful facility, the Thomas and Mack Center, that seats 17,000, 18,000 people with corporate boxes, private boxes and lounges, and they fill that for every game. And so they're very bold about saying that the UNLV basketball program has to be in the entertainment business, and they have to compete with what are the other alternatives as far as people who live in that community and people who come in there from out of town.
And that image has to tarnish a little bit all of college athletics.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Larry, one of the big issues is, should athletes be paid or should they not be paid? And
Dick, you want to pay?
You want to pay athletes?
No, you don't want to play. They are receiving full tuition, fees, room and books, and that is equivalent to a part-time job that a student might have on the side. The hours are very seldom do they put in over 40 hours a week with basketball. I can't really think of too many examples when they do that. And I think you lose complete perspective of what you're doing. Again, as Dr. Reno and Dr. Vanderhill have alluded to, and our philosophy, and I think I can speak for the athletic department as a whole, they're students first, and that's what we want them to be. We want them to feel that they are. And once you start paying them, I really believe then they're going to lose perspective of what they're at college for, and that is for their education. They're going to start thinking that they're there as a minor league. They're preparing, apprenticing for their professional careers.
That's a good point, and I don't want to be overly cynical at this time of the year on this particular point. But I have long held the view that if you are going to pay undergraduate athletes in any sport, then it ought to be the responsibility of the professional leagues to pay them. If you think it's important to pay basketball players, then given all the revenue floating around the NBA today, they ought to be able to come up with the money. If you want to pay football players, then let the NFL come up with the money, again, given the amount of money that's circulating around the NFL today from all the things that we've talked about, gate receipts, sponsors, television revenues, and such. Now, as I said, that's a somewhat cynical view, but I happen to agree with Dick. And I noticed, though, that in a recent poll in a national newspaper, that the people who responded to the question that we're discussing here, 55% of those who responded said that we ought not to pay athletes on on athletic grants, and 45% said that we ought to pay them. Now, that's getting pretty close, gentlemen.
That would seem to indicate that maybe it's not such a bad idea in practice, but in fact, or in theory, but in practice it might send out the wrong message.
Well, the problem, too, is finances. See, John's touched upon a burning issue in the NCAA. This comes up almost annually in some form, either trying to increase the amount of the Pell Grant and the grant in aid, or finding some other way to pay the athlete. But economics always comes back into the picture when you start adding on and paying the athletes more and more. And that's why we're seeing a proposal. We'll see a proposal at the January NCAA meeting to have aid based upon need, because of the difficulties that many institutions are having with finances. And I'm not talking about Division II or Division III or some of the Division I schools that are not major. I'm talking about major institutions who are having financial problems.
Now, this proposal would apply to all athletes, those that we now consider on full ride, that athletic scholarships would be based on
with a couple of exceptions.
On financial need.
It would it would apply to Division I athletes currently on full grants in aid. The proposal would limit the full grants only to football and basketball for men. Then for women, the women would be able to give full grants in aid in basketball, and then they have the opportunity to select 2 other sports for grants in aid. What that means then is that all other sports, other than the 5, if say we had those 5 here at Ball State, all other grants in aid would be limited strictly to tuition and fees.
And this is intended to address the financial problems of...
It's proposed by the president of Lehigh University, Dr. Likens, and he has indicated the reason that he is proposing this is to provide the additional monies needed for women's athletics. And he's got a real problem with that proposal.
And yet a lot of the women are really outraged by this.
Absolutely.
Because of the problems it would create with Title IX and the difficulties you would get into in a conference, say, where one school wanted to have all their grant and aid female sport be swimming, and no other schools in the conference would want to do that. I mean, it's an incredible imbalance in what you might end up as far as competition is concerned.
Well, Donna Lopiano, who is the director of athletics for women at Texas, she just says that Likens has not thought it through very well, although he presented it at the President's Commission last June in Orlando, and it received some favorable comments.
Perhaps not a bad idea, but it's not going to pass, is it? Not next month.
Well, there are some who think that it's very close.
John, excuse me if I can interrupt. Let me ask you about the politics, because it appears to me that the Ball States or the Mid-American Conference would be more or less on the cutting edge between the very big schools and the Pac-10 and the Big Ten, for example, and the smaller state schools in the Southern Conference. The average, like Appalachian State, has a student population of 6,000. Are we kind of on the cutting edge between these 2 divisions, the Appalachians and the Indianas?
That's correct, John. What would happen if this proposal passes? In order for us to remain on that cutting edge and be close to the major Division I schools, we would have to increase all of our non-revenue sports to the NCAA level as far as number of the amount of aid. Right now we give tennis, men's tennis, they get 2 full grants in aid. The NCAA limit is 5. Golf is the same way. We give 2, the NCAA limit is 5. Now, if this proposal passed, it would mean that Bill Richards, with his tennis team, would only have 2 tuitions. And Earl Yestingsmeyer with his would only have 2 tuitions.
In golf.
In golf.
Well, you should also mention, I think, John, that what these 2 coaches do now, because both Bill Richards and Earl Yestingsmeyer have been tremendously successful, is they take their full grants now and divide them up.
Right.
So they can give partial awards to a greater number of players.
Would this Prop 39 cause you problems, Dick?
I think that the football and the basketball programs are somewhat immune to that as far as in the men's side, as far as how it will affect them. I think as Dr. Reno mentioned, that there might be, although it has not been a well thought out proposal, it's been kind of a little bit off the cuff, a little bit something that I think that a lot of administrators, coaches are talking about behind closed doors because it's a very sensitive issue. I think that there will be more, maybe more strength behind it than people realize, just because of the dollar. I came to Ball State. Ball State's very fortunate to be funded as well as it is, as you said, as state student fees are the main impetus of the budget in the program. It's not the gate revenues that we get each ball game, but in a lot of the schools, as I came from Weber State, we generated $600,000 in basketball, which we were a non-traditional student institution. We had close to 6,000 season tickets, and we profited over $320,000 a year for the most part in basketball, and that funded the so-called non-revenue sports. And so this Proposition 39, as it's labeled, I think could be a real interesting once it comes to the table there in San Francisco.
If I could get back to Larry's question that he asked me at the front of the program about the student coming to class, Dick, the basketball team has this record or this reputation on campus of only missing 5 classes in the entire fall semester. That's probably better than most students who are working part-time.
Quickly, we're almost out of time.
Well,
Go ahead, Nancy.
yeah, it's just something that we really emphasize that. There's a lot of exploitation that goes on, a lot that I alluded to in the media that you do read is accurate, that coaches,
Quickly,
they don't demand their kids go to class, but our kids do go to class. And again, just to go back to what we started with talking, that they're students first.
Thanks, John Rouse, Dick Hunsaker, John Reno, and Warren Vanderhill for sharing this time with us and your views. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.